All right. So I think it was last week or the week before this last week. In Cognition Futures, I think Jesse mentioned this uh, Substack post. This is why we don't get complexity. Stafford Beer, requisite variety, and systems thinking. And this kind of relates to the thing we were doing with the Evergood regulator theorem, because one of the sort of key components of the Evergood regulator theorem is this term requisite variety, or this concept of variety that Ashby poses. And the idea is that systems need variety to be sort of robust or to be adaptive. And if there isn't that variety there, then the response is brittle, or at least in terms of the model has to recapitulate the variety of a system. And if the model doesn't do that, then the model is brittle. So this is, something to think about with respect to large language models, especially. Do large language models have requisite variety or sufficient variety to model the world? Because, we think of language as the system, or human communication as a system. Large language models then have to have the requisite variety to respond to that, or to match that. And that's, of course, what we call an isomorphism. So the isomorphism is where the model can match the system's behavior. And when you don't have that matching, you don't have that isomorphism, when that breaks down, you end up with hallucinations, or a model that can't really give an appropriate answer. And so this is, again, it's all analogical, but basically, I think this concept of requisite variety fits into that discussion. And so this is kind of an article talking about the broader enterprise of complex systems, talking about Stafford Beer's research. Of course, Stafford Beer, as a cyberneticist, developed the CyberSyn project, did a lot of stuff with organizational cybernetics and applying cybernetics to organizations. He designed this elaborate model of sort of an embodied model of the organization, where the organization was sort of like a brain interacting with its environment. And so, wonderful thinker, and systems level thinker as well. So this is where this post is coming from. And the reason I wanted to bring it up is because I think it does fit into a lot of these themes. So this is this discussion is this week I read a fascinating political discussion on an adjacent topic from Dan Williams, Conspicuous Cognition, in which he contrasts the views of Walter Lippmann and John Dewey on, paraphrasing, how politics should handle the ignorance of voters. And then, there's an example here. And then kind of getting at what Stafford Beer said about these kinds of things. Stafford Beer had this concept called the attenuation of requisite variety. So, of course, Stafford Beer was operating after the Evergood regulator theorem paper was published in 1970. I mean, he was doing things in the 70s and 80s. And this idea is attenuation of requisite variety, meaning that, it's not enough just to have variety, or to have the appropriate variety for the problem. So if you have a system and the system exhibits variety, then you need to be able to match the things that are happening in that system with an appropriate response by the model. So the model has to have access to most of or all of the states of the system, and in order to match it, obviously. In some of the work we've done on thinking about this, we kind of refer to as aliasing. So the idea is that in system, or in signal processing, you have this concept of aliasing, where you sample, say, like a video at a much lower frame rate than the action is happening. So the action's happening at, say, 60 frames per second, and your video is at the resolution of 20 frames per second. Well, it doesn't sort of capture the entire animation. It captures kind of like cuts of the animation. So it sort of blends the animation together, and you don't get a proper view of the action. And so it is with the number of states you have in your model. If you have too few states in your model, you alias your sort of what your model is representing and the output. So you're not getting a full representation. You're having to blend in, fill in different states with sort of an average state, and it's not, the kind of output that you would like. You have it in the other direction as well, where you have you're sampling too much of the system. So the system might have, say, 4 or 5 states that are of importance, and your model generates 200 or 300 states. And so you're sort of creating states where none exist, creating distinctions where none exist, and that can be a problem as well. So, there is this sampling issue between the model and the system. And then attenuation, of course, is interesting in that context because you're attenuating that sampling process, or attenuating the sampling rate. So in Stafford Beer's mind, attenuation or requisite variety is the following. Cybernetics is about feedback loops. So it's where you have a system and you build a model from that system, and you sample that system to inform the model, and you sample that system to update the model in its current state, and you keep doing that in this feedback loop, and you try to do it at the right rate with the right number of states. And if you don't, then you end up with these kinds of problems. So cybernetics is about feedback loops, providing information back to the system about how things are working or not working, whether the environment has changed, and so forth. Okay, so that's something from Stafford Beer, an observation about that relationship between the system and the model. So what these posts have in common is that in both cases, and this is talking about this post by Dan Williams, and then this other post by Henry Farrell, where Henry Farrell talks about cybernetics as the possible science of the polycrisis. And I don't have to mention what the polycrisis is. You can figure that one out on your own. So those two posts, and thinking about Stafford Beer's views on requisite variety. So, basically we're trying to figure out how to manage complexity. That's what we're trying to do here. We need to be able to simplify and adapt and stabilize social systems without turning to some sort of top-down control, like authoritarianism or fascism. So, there's a temptation in, thinking about social systems to say, well, if we just controlled it from the top down, and this is actually true in managing organizations too, not just in politics, but, there's this temptation to think, well, I can just manage things from the top down. If we have good hierarchical control over our organization, then everything will be good or orderly. And, a lot of organizations will do this where they, have strict rules from the top, or they have 30 managers, and each manager is supposed to impose order in different ways. But the only thing you really end up with in a case like that is employees have to report to 30 managers, and nothing gets done because it's paralyzing the organization. When in fact, and it doesn't even work. When in fact, what you need is to have some system of sort of localized, decentralized control, and then some other mechanisms from the top down to manage that control. So this is something that is not a new problem. This is something, in fact, in organizations we've dealt with for years and years and years, and thinking about how to make those organizations as effective as possible. Okay, so that's kind of thinking about this. In the first post, this problem was presented as the paradox of the democratic process, in which unskilled humans are asked to lend their vote to complex political strategies about which they know nothing. Williams is concerned that this opens a door to simple storytelling by populists. Meanwhile, Farrell concerns himself with the problem of fixing the sprawling, complex, labyrinthine mess of U.S. public services. This week, there have been a lot of attempts to make things better in simple ways, or at least claims to make things better in simple ways. And sometimes, these things get broken by thinking about them too simplistically. So, this is a pop-up, and I hate this. But basically, there are a couple of rules. So basically what this post is getting at is that there are 5 sort of rules for managing complex systems. And so the idea is that complex systems is one in which the parts are recombined to create lots of things. So you have, say, like 10 states or 10 sort of parts. And, they don't just make 10 things, they make maybe 100 things or 1,000 things if they're reconfigured in different ways. And so sometimes systems have a great amount of complexity. And so when you have that kind of complexity, you have to think about every eventuality. You have to have, contingency plans for every outcome. And that's probably not possible using a top-down technique or set of techniques. So if you're a manager and you're trying to manage your team, and your team, you maybe have 10 members of your team, and they're doing 10 different things, that's a lot of combinations of things that can go wrong, or things that happen in the team. And so if you're thinking about this in terms of a very strict top-down approach, then you have to have eventualities for all those things. You have to have a program for all those things. And that can take a lot of effort just to come up with that, much less to implement it. And the problem there is maybe it doesn't even help you, because when you try to over-specify your system, you don't allow for spontaneous things to happen. And so that's a complex system. A complex adaptive system is one in which the parts can self-organize into a lot of different things that are in a way that's adaptive, or that can improve things. So, a complex adaptive system might be like a living system, like an organism, or it could be like, a team in an organization where you're self-organizing your workflows and your interactions into ways that improve your performance. Okay, so and then there are these rules of systems thinking. So rule number 1 is parts combine to make the whole, and you can't necessarily look at that in a inherently reductionist way. You have to look at the parts as parts, and then the whole as the whole. So, it's very much the idea that you have this emergent structure that kind of is the outcome of interactions. And then it's a distinct thing from just being a sum of its parts. And so then that's rule number 2. Parts come together at distinct time scales or length scales. So you have things like a leaf, that's part of a tree, that's part of an ecosystem, that's part of a planet. And at all those, or planetary ecosystems, at all those scales, they're very different. So you can't just say a bunch of leaves make a tree, a bunch of tree makes a forest, and so on. Rule number 3 of systems thinking is that emergent pathways become more complex over time. So this is because they have more doors to open within them. So as you kind of have your system and it's evolving, it's moving from state to state, and it's, that's that in and of itself. You have like maybe 1,000 states, but now you have these pathways that go from state to state. You have these chains of events, and you have these contingencies. So if I move from state to state, it's not just that I visit one state and then another state and then another state. A lot of times I have branching events where the system will go off into 2 states given any sort of thing that happens. Like, some critical event might happen that could drive us down one path instead of another. And so, understanding how to make decisions in that environment are very hard to do from the top down. Rule number 4 of systems thinking is that we can look backwards. That we can look backwards through the things that we have passed through, but it is really hard to look forwards. So this is this idea of inverse systems. So like if you think about like maybe a structure like a termite mound, it's very easy to sort of trace that process forward. If you're modeling this, say, in an agent-based model, or if you're just observing a termite mound being built, you can trace the interactions of the termites and how they build the mound. You can do this with wasp's nest as well, and I covered a paper on this in DivaWorm, I believe, a while back, where they kind of studied different wasp's nests and the topology of the wasp nest. And the idea is that wasps will carry little balls of mud and deposit them in different places and build the nest. So it's very organized and very ordered, but the design is variable based on, these different individual actions. And so the different individual actions actually are based on prior collective behavior. And what you can do is you can trace out or predict the forward process. So everything going forward, I can say, well, this set of interactions happened to build this thing. The thing you can't really do very well is to go backwards and trace back those actions. Because as it turns out, you can observe something unfolding, but it's very hard to go backwards in time and sort of infer. So you can predict maybe individual actions, but you can't infer them. And that's because these individual actions are different every time that process is set in motion. So for every time a bunch of wasps build a nest or a bunch of termites build a mound, they do it in a slightly different way. And so you can observe the forward process, but the backwards process is much harder to infer. So that's rule 4. And then rule 5 is where systems pivot around stable attractors until they don't. So there's a lot of stuff on attractors and their role in, in popular science and in sort of this fashionable mode of thinking about all systems in this way. So this is, the idea that you have stability or you have these stable points of a system, of a self-organizing system, that can maybe shift over time or become suddenly unstable. Or, we don't really understand the conditions under which attractors form and attractors sort of become irrelevant, or systems shift into new attractor basins. But that's critical to understanding the global state of the system. So that means that if you're dealing with a politics or decision-making scheme, then you have to know kind of the things that are most efficacious for changing where you are. And this is, I think in a lot of governmental policy, this is a big thing because, if you want to control something like inflation, they have different levers that you can use. I mean, economists have different levers they can use to sort of affect inflation, to make sure that inflation isn't running too hot or, that there's deflation. But overall, I mean, they have those tools, but then it's limited as to what the effectiveness of those tools are. So sometimes you get into a situation where it's hard to control the overall rate of inflation just based on those tools. And, the actions are kind of like sticking, poking the system with a stick and hoping it'll respond in the way you desire. And, that's sometimes it doesn't work very well. And it's not the fault of the policymakers or the actors, it's just because it's a very complex system. So these are these rules, and then the author here goes into this anecdote about creating a little tribe and how it maps to this sort of model of complexity. And then complexity is about trying to understand the future. Simplicity is about trying to understand the past. Experts / technocrats and historians are very good at understanding the past, but not so good at telling us about the future. In truth, it's not really fair to call interpreting the past simple, but it is simple in the sense that it is knowable. So simplicity is really kind of a thing about knowledge. So, when we talk about complexity, we're talking about things like emergence, or we're talking about things that don't have a strict cause and effect. Like if we manipulate something, the outcome isn't always the effect, a very strong effect. Sometimes those effects are attenuated. Sometimes they don't happen in a linear fashion. So if something is knowable, it's easy, it's simple, right? If you know something is going to happen, you can rely on that, it's simple. If not, it's complex. And so this is where this distinction comes into play. Now Stafford Beer wanted us to understand systems so we could better manage variation. So again, this theme of variation comes up. Variation is just a fancy way of saying change. I mean, it is change, but it's also like diversity. I guess variety is sort of the number of states that you have, a number of different states that you have. So if you have a bunch of states that are generally similar, that's something that's easier to say control or know than if you have a bunch of states that are sort of all over the place, that they're highly diverse or highly divergent or heterogeneous. And so this is just basically, variation is a fancy way of saying change or novelty or difference or stuff that doesn't fit the learned patterns, rules, and technologies. Unfortunately for 2025 humans, this discipline was christened cybernetics, and then it just became kind of a science fiction curiosity, although I don't know if I'd agree with that. I think it's just kind of, the term is more powerful than, or more legendary than the actual techniques developed underneath it. And this is annoying because cybernetics just means steering of a system. So the steersman analogy of kybernetic or steering of a system. So that's all it is. It's just about how do you control a very complex system. And it's very different from controlling a simple system. So if we stop calling it cybernetics and call it coordination, we might be more able to wrap our heads around it. And so when a stable system experiences variation, it must adapt or die. And then, so this leads us to this rule number 6, and that is evolution has developed a toolkit to help organisms adapt to challenges or experiences in variation. Many involve rule number 1, which is parts recombining. We tend to call this cooperation and dismiss it as a rather flimsy and weak premise. It isn't. Recombination of parts, coalitions, cooperation are how we went from being bacteria to big brain complex apes, I guess. According to Stafford Beer, the key to dealing with variation is to meet it with an equal and opposite amount of variation. The law of requisite variety, which is, of course, this distinction between the system and the model. So if the system has a lot of variation, the model needs to have a lot of variation that counters that, or that matches that, is a better way to put it. Controlling variation, then, is described as variety attenuation. So being able to control variation and say, this is the mapping of variation, but then all these variants, we know kind of what to do in every, we don't know what to do in every case, but they're different sort of mean responses we can give that kind of cover our bases. It's a kind of a distinction that's interesting because, the claim here is that we can control complexity. So we're doing the same thing we're doing for the top-down case, except we're doing it in a different way. And the question is that really a thing we can do? Or is it just simply that some systems are so variety-filled and chaotic and complex that we can't control them no matter what? And that, of course, is the whole idea of chaos. And aside from the sort of the pop culture shorthand, there are systems that operate sort of on the edge of chaos, and they're extremely hard to deal with, even in this way. So this is kind of, again, a lot about systems thinking and requisite variety. And the point about requisite variety is that these parts need to cover enough decision space or action space to attenuate the novelty. So the variety, again, has to sample from all parts of this space of possibilities to be able to sort of get your arms around it and respond appropriately. So, and then this is a little bit about Daniel Kahneman and Cass Sunstein publishing some work on informational noise. And then, of course, using the term noise is just another word for variation. This is the diagram from their work. So this is where you have this combination of bias and variation. So, of course, in the world of cognitive science, we talk about bias, which is where something is favored or disfavored. So you might favor a certain idea or a certain response, and that's bias. So there's this combination of bias and noise. So in the upper left-hand corner of this diagram, you have something that's biased with little variation. So everything is clustered together. There's very little noise, but there's a lot of bias. And the responses occur all in this one part of the circle. And then at the upper right, you have noisy, not biased. So it means that the response is all over the map, all over the circle, but it's spread out. At the lower left, you have noisy and biased, which is where the responses are spread out, but they're over on one side of the response space, covering just a small part of the circle. And then not noisy and not biased, or precise, which is where you don't have bias, you don't have noise, and so your responses are all focused towards the center of the circle. So that's what I mean by precision. And so that's, kind of this very cognitive science view of responding and attenuating variety. So this is, again, this is a circle. And it's just like suggesting that you can do this just if you have the right response to the circle. I know that's not really the point, but it does seem a little bit hard to map to practice, let's just say. So the problem is that you have different circles that maybe represent different problem spaces, and maybe the problem is that we're operating in a problem space that has different contexts. So, we can think about experts and the voting public in the case of politics operating in different circles. And so we're trying to target something in the first circle, whereas, in fact, the second circle is not being paid attention to. So that maybe suggests that we need to attenuate noise, but we also need to think about how biased our response is. Okay, so then this is kind of going on here, and there's this work called super forecasters, which is this idea that you can sort of predict the future better if you know kind of the right methodology or the secret sauce to doing so. So it's just this is, again, a lot of this stuff has been around for many years in different forms. So people have made these suggestions before. This is nothing new under the sun. It's just kind of reminding people periodically that this is, in fact, the way the world works.